And now on Radio 4, it's time for Any Questions. Here's Chris Mason.
Hello again. We are in York on a mooch about earlier on. Plenty of flags. Yes, some Union ones and St George's ones, but the Yorkshire flag too. A white rose on a blue background. Definitely the most prominent. We are at the University of York, a tiered audience in front of us in a lecture theatre. And with us, the leader of the Liberal Democrats and former Cabinet Minister Sir Ed Davey, the Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury, the Labour MP Bridget Phillipson, a Yorkshire MP, a Conservative MP, the MP for Morley and Outwood, Andrea Jenkyns, and a graduate of this university, a journalist, columnist and author, Peter Hitchens. York, your Any Questions panel. Martin has our first question. Hi, Martin.
Hi. Should we turn back migrant boats in the Channel?
Peter Hitchens.
It's not practical. This whole proposal by the Home Secretary it's a dead rat thrown onto the political table to try and distract attention from the government's huge mess over national insurance. It's not a serious proposal, and it even contains the words, only if it is safe to do so, which means, of course, that the people involved will always say it's not safe to do so. We aren't Australia. We don't have a huge passage of sea between ourselves and our nearest neighbour, nor are we dealing with New Guinea. We're dealing with France. It's very regrettable what's happening, and it's obviously wrong that people should be paying people smugglers huge sums of money to get them to jump the immigration queue. And however much you may admire the enterprise of people who actually fight their way across the Channel to this country, it doesn't mean that they should be allowed to jump the queue because they're prepared to pay criminals to do so and put themselves in hot to criminals for the rest of their lives. But this is not really the answer to the most fundamental question, which is why are these huge flows of people coming across the Mediterranean and indeed through Turkey, through Europe, to this country, which is actually, and I can't help bringing this up because it seems to me it really does need to be said over and over again, it is directly the fault of the Blair government and the Iraq war, which tore the Middle East to pieces, the British and American and other governments' interventions in Syria, which have turned millions of people into refugees and tens of thousands into corpses, and of course David Cameron's absurd intervention in Libya, which has also caused a great deal of this. You cannot overcome it by making populist plans for turning people back in the Channel.
Okay.
It's not realistic, and it's stupid, and it shouldn't be taken seriously. It's solely designed to turn the debate to something else.
Given, Peter, looking at the statistics, more than 1,500 migrants across the English Channel by boat this week, what should, therefore, the government do?
Well, it's very difficult for them to do anything, because with no cooperation from France, this is the whole problem. You look at this over and over again. What is the civilised thing which you can do to stop it? There may be things that you can do to people who've arrived here illegally, such as some countries have done. So in that case, if you're going to get benefits, you should work for them. I think some of the Scandinavian countries have done this. You might start saying that if you've arrived here illegally, then your chances of ever getting indefinite right to remain should be taken away from you. I don't know exactly what you can do. What you certainly cannot do is push boats backwards in the Channel, which you then might sink, or hand them over to the French, who will then send them back. That is neither safe, nor practical, nor politically realistic.
Okay.
And that, I'm afraid that is the difficulty. We have this huge flow of people coming across Europe now. Many of them want to come here, and we cannot stop them by any humane means. So we're going to have to work out some way of coping with the fact that people are arriving here illegally. I do very much think that those who come here legally through the proper methods should be those who get the preferential treatment.
OK. Bridget Phillipson for Labour.
I think it's both dangerous, lacking humanity, but also just isn't going to work. I think it is just appalling that the Home Secretary is even considering putting public servants in a position that might actually jeopardise people's lives, because that's what we've heard in terms of what would happen if these kinds of measures were to be taken. It does jeopardise people's lives on those boats. Now, of course, we want to see action against criminal gangs that exploit people. But as we've seen in recent weeks and months with Afghanistan, there are desperate people facing persecution, many of whom we owe a debt because of the work they did with us, supporting our troops, supporting the British government in the action that we were taking in Afghanistan. And those desperate people, and many of them are incredibly desperate, should be supported to have safe and legal routes to seek sanctuary in our country. I do not think the approach that the Home Secretary is recommending is consistent with our values as a nation. I don't think it's the kind of country we are, and I do not think it's the kind of country that we should be.
So, Davey, next.
No, I completely disagree with the Home Secretary. But we must stop the crossings because they're dangerous and people are dying, and we need to find other ways. And the fact that they're increasing in number is a failure of Priti Patel, the Home Secretary. How do we do it? We have to offer safe and legal routes for genuine refugees to come to our country. We're doing that with some of the Afghan refugees, the resettlement programs. They could be extended. We should have extended them more in the case of Syria. There are programs like family reunion programs, which the Conservative government have turned their back on. There are ways, humane ways, which are completely in line with British values, where we offer sanctuary as we've done for so many centuries. I have a real problem with the Conservatives' overall approach to refugees. The Conservatives say they're the party of the family and the party of hard work, except when it comes to refugees. They deliberately separate families by not allowing family reunion. How dreadful. And they stop asylum seekers being able to work when they come to this country. There's a ban on asylum seekers working. I think it's horrific, and I think it's got to stop. And Priti Patel has got to change her ways. She's a very bad Home Secretary.
To Andrea Jenkyns in a second, but just a specific, Ed, on the challenge as far as those crossing the Channel are concerned. I take the broader point you make about other legal routes, but given that there are still so many people trying to cross in boats, what should the government do about those in boats this weekend, for instance? That they're on the water, they're on some sort of craft, they're heading to the UK. What should the government do?
Well, what all sensible governments do when you're faced with international waters is you have international cooperation. And Priti Patel has essentially picked an argument with the French. You can ask her why she's done that. She should be working with the French. She should be cooperating with the French. She should be finding ways to go through it. But this is a government that doesn't like to cooperate internationally.
The government's been talking to the French government, hasn't it?
Well, I think you can see from the reaction of the French government to this attitude, to this particular proposal, that she has not been very successful in her diplomacy. And whether it's her fault, Dominic Raab's fault, or, let's be clear, the Prime Minister's fault, I think this government's got it completely wrong.
Andrea Jenkyns.
Thank you. Well, I'm probably the only one in this room. Look at the audience, but I agree with our Home Secretary, Priti Patel. I mean, what do we do? Do we put a big neon sign saying, everybody welcome? That'll just encourage people to do more dangerous crossings. Of course we don't. This is the right rhetoric, actually. And we must discourage illegal and safe crossing. And regarding Ed's point about France, look, we've given £54 million of British taxpayers' money. It's got conditions on it to France. We expect them to double their numbers of police officers to patrol the coast. And if they're not living up to their side of the bargain, then we need to hold them to account. This is British taxpayers' money. And we know that the border force, they have got to go in line with international law and maritime law, and they've got to make sure it's deemed safe to do so. But I think it's right to have that rhetoric out there. We don't want people to do this unsafe crossings, and quite frankly, let's also remember, we're talking here, as Bridget said, it's not just refugees. We've done amazing with Afghanistan and bringing refugees over and the measures that we've put in place. We're talking about a lot of economic migrants coming over via this means. And so we need to do everything possible to discourage this crossing because it's a dangerous crossing.
So, Ed, briefly.
The Home Office have shown that about 98% of those people who come over on small boats apply for asylum, and the vast majority gain it. So let's get some facts into this. And I have to say, for the Conservatives here, the fact that they have opposed Liberal Democrat and other opposition parties' plans to improve laws to enable family reunion is a disgrace, and they've got to change that.
Peter had his hand up.
Well, Andrea Jenkyns says it's the right rhetoric, which I think is a giveaway, really, because it is rhetoric. It will not stop anybody from arriving. It's very typical of the Conservative Party, which has for many, many years posed as a party which wanted to restrict immigration to please its voters and supporters, but has never actually succeeded in doing so at any stage. It is purely posturing, and it's interesting that it's made very shortly before the weather changes, after which for many months it will be very difficult for people to cross the channel in any case. The political question remains. These huge flows of population heading towards Western Europe have been caused by disastrous decisions, widely publicly supported, I should say, as to create wars, particularly in the Middle East and North Africa, which we are now paying a very heavy price for. The next time anybody comes up and suggests one of these wars, will you please fight much harder against them getting away with it?
Bridget.
I think rather than picking a fight with the French authorities or picking a fight with the RNLI or whoever else the Home Secretary wants to pick a fight with on any kind of given day of the week, let's try and see some effective measures to work with the French. So not just at the Channel, but inland as well. You know, I think, talking about this kind of rhetoric all the time doesn't get us anywhere. And I think we hear a lot about how, our country shouldn't be welcoming people who are fleeing persecution. I mean, just over the summer, I visited a project in Sunderland that works to support refugees, asylum seekers who've come to our country. What you will hear from those people about the persecution that they have faced and the situation that they have left, families left behind, the last thing that they wanted to do was to leave their home where they wanted a future, the last thing that they wanted. But what they're seeing at the moment are very, very long waits to even have their case heard. The Home Office should be doing a lot more to process cases more quickly, to make sure that people can have their interview and get on with their lives, because, holding people in that kind of limbo is just completely wrong as well.
Thank you. If you want to join the conversation on Saturday afternoon on any answers, here is the number. 03700 100 444, 03700 100 444. You can call from 12:30. Anita is on the radio as usual at 2. Our second question from Roderick. Hello, Roderick.
Hello. How long do panel members believe that the recent interruptions to supplies of various goods and services will continue?
Bridget Phillipson for Labour.
Well, sadly, as we've heard from the Food and Drink Federation, those kind of blockages and delays are likely to continue for the foreseeable future, which is why unless action is taken by the government, which is why it's essential that we see action to sort out the disruption in the supply chain. So, we've heard, for example, that the government are suggesting that HGV drivers could work longer hours. I mean, what I think matters most is for the government to work with businesses, to work with trade unions, to get good terms and conditions for people, to get more people into the industry. We face that real shortage there. Now, of course, COVID and Brexit has had an impact, but this problem has been coming down the line for the last 10 years. We know we face an ageing workforce in the HGV sector, and the government just has not done enough to get people in. Now, as we approach Christmas, I think the last thing people want to see are further delays and disruption, in terms of goods coming into the country. It is having a big, wider knock-on effect on the economy as well. We've seen today that, growth within the economy is very, very weak. We're still at a really fragile point for our economic recovery. I think that's also why it's completely wrong that in addition to facing these kinds of problems, we're also seeing a lot being brought forward by the government that's going to hit families at a really tough time as well, whether that's universal credit, the national insurance rise that working people are going to see, increases in council tax, prices are going up, and that's going to be really hard for people to manage.
Focusing on the specifics of these logistical challenges and lack of wagon drivers, for instance, how much do you blame Brexit?
I think clearly it is a factor, absolutely. But I think you do have to look at the wider problems within the sector that we've seen, as I say, coming for the last decade. We were already facing an ageing workforce, and the government's done nothing to sort that out. Working conditions can often be pretty poor for a lot of HGV drivers, and that has to improve. But again, I just want the government to work constructively with people to try and find a way through this, not just kind of casting about blame, which is what it seems to come down to all the time. So let's see that we can get more
Who's the
people into
government
the
blaming?
industry.
Who's the government blaming?
Well, we've seen, well, there's the suggestion that, people have returned home, there's delays around COVID, I think that's part of it. But we've faced this shortage now for some years. It's been obvious the problems were going to get worse. As I say, I think Brexit and COVID have exacerbated long-standing problems that are there. I think we need to broaden the people coming into the industry. So opening it up to more women, for example, making it a more attractive career, improving wages, improving working conditions. I think there's a lot that the government could do working with business and trade unions to make that happen.
Andrea Jenkyns.
Chris, Roderick, I'm a trucker's daughter. My dad was a trucker up and down the country. Growing up, I'd go away with him at times. And I have to say that I visited a local transport firm in my constituency a few weeks ago. The trucks are far better nowadays than it ever was when I went out with my dad. And I want to actually start by, because I think they are the unsung heroes, especially during Brexit. They're the drivers up and down the country who kept our economy going and food on the table. So I think we need to actually take our hat off to them.
What's gone wrong, which means there aren't as many as we need?
Well, there's several factors here. We know some has gone back to the EU, but there's also COVID. Regarding the Brexit thing, which I know a lot of Remainers have been, emailing me saying it's down to Brexit. But if that was the case, look at France, Germany and Spain. They're having the same issues of driver shortages. But during COVID, especially, I think, first of all, it's the cost of getting a licence. It's a massive cost attached to it, and you've got to pay that as an individual, so that can put people off. It's quite a decent salary now, speaking to the different transport industries, what they pay the drivers. During COVID, the DVLA, on average, they'd be processing LGV, HGV licences about 1,150 a week, which is nowhere near enough, and especially with the backlog we had with COVID. But I know the government's invested in that now. As a trucker's daughter, I've got an interest in it. And they're processing over 15,000 a week now. So that's one aspect. But I think it's actually making, like Bridget said, it's making the industry more of an interesting career for all people from society. And the stuff that we're doing, we're doing this apprenticeship scheme, which I think is great. Which was
There's 100,000 drivers, a shortage of 100,000 drivers, according to the Road Haulage Association. We're seeing so many sectors, aren't we, saying that they have shortages. The Christmas rush, not a million miles away. Can you say anything to reassure our listener that kind of gap, 100,000 drivers short, is going to be plugged anytime soon?
Well, it's the same with any type of industry, whether it's, the NHS training doctors up and nurses up. It does take time. However, the government have been working closely with, the industry, because it is private sector led. We're working closely with the industry. They're doing their part. And as I said, by putting these apprenticeship schemes in place, we've been rolling back EU legislation. For example, you needed a separate test to drive a car with a trailer. Little things like this.
Maybe that's a good idea.
Yes, that's what we're doing. We're relaxing the hours, but where drivers can now.
Now, hang on. Sorry, what are you relaxing about driving with a trailer?
You used to need a separate test, didn't you, to be able to drive a car with a trailer? We're relaxing that in EU legislation.
Reassure our listener who is following a car with a trailer that's a good idea. No, it's not a joke, is it?
No.
It's serious. I get that there's a trade-off between how much you regulate and the extent to which it unblocks this shortage. But there's a trade-off there, isn't there? And there's a safety question.
You'll always find a safety question in anything, but I think let's face it, I think there's more robust actually driving tests now than ever before.
Okay.
I don't know if I would have passed it even after my fifth time of trying when I was passing my test. But I know they're working very closely with industry, and the food and drink industry as well, and I do believe we'll see a massive improvement. Yes, there will be that time lapse while new drivers get trained up.
Okay. Sir Ed Davey next.
Well, I think this is a crisis. Crisis in shortage of lorry drivers. But if you talk to people in the hotel and cafe and restaurants, they haven't got the staff for the hospitality sector. We're seeing building materials, the prices of wood and cement going through the roof. We're seeing not enough workers for chicken processing factories. We're seeing food shelves that don't have any food on them. We're seeing shortages of beer in some places. I think in any other world, this would be seen as a bit of a failure by the government. I think, a huge failure. And I think we could be looking, as we look to Christmas, at a chaotic Christmas. And I think the government just aren't taking this properly and seriously enough.
So what would you do now? You've been in government.
Yeah.
If you were in government now, what would you do?
Well, first of all, I'd listen to business. And what business is saying is they want the government to have some visas for lorry drivers as one of the things they're wanting. They're wanting business are wanting government to take a whole range of different actions, but this government is sort of deaf to business. And it's really interesting, isn't it? The Conservatives used to be the party of business. They used to listen to business. But they're not interested anymore in what I would call common sense approach.
Well, what's the evidence that they're not listening to business?
Well, if you talk to the CBI is saying they're looking at a 2-year shortage of labour unless the government act. We heard from Ian Wright, the Chief Executive of the Food and Drink Federation, who's saying that because of Brexit, we're looking at permanent changes. Now, what has caused this? Clearly, COVID has had an impact. Andrea's quite right on that. I think Bridget's right. There have been some long-term issues as well. There's been problems in DVLA licensing. But if people think that Brexit has nothing to do with this, I think they're living in cloud cuckoo land. There's a huge problem in our economy, and it was caused by Boris Johnson and the Conservatives.
Can I come in here, Chris?
Andrea.
Thank you. First of all, the organisations you mentioned, like the CBI, was completely against Brexit in the first place and had the same fatalistic attitude like you've got. I've got more faith, actually, in the private sector and the government. If we can get through a pandemic and still get deliveries...
but the point is we can't.
No, I'm just saying when everybody was ordering online then, let's face it, people couldn't get to the supermarket, then we will get through a busy Christmas period.
Are you sure?
Yes.
So what I'm trying to understand is, if we were able to get through these problems during COVID, what's happened now? Why are the problems occurring now? Is it because the economy is opening up and the problems that were caused by your government are now really evident? I think that's the truth. And I think unless you listen to business and the Conservatives listen to the business, we're going to have a real problems in our country and Christmas is going to be miserable.
But we are listening to businesses.
You're not doing what they say.
Our government's in conversations, on a daily basis with the industry, and they're working closely with the private sector to ensure that we have a good Christmas. I have more faith.
Peter Hitchens.
Thank you. In answer to Roderick's question, I think we're going to have to get used to this. I feel a strange sense of nostalgia for the days when I lived in the Soviet Union. Oh, God. 30 years ago, under a stupid, dogmatic authoritarian government which couldn't get anything right. And here we have it again. Whatever view you may take of this lot before, we've been working at this for years, and now we're finally getting empty shelves in the shops. It's
so Ed Davey's shoulders are shaking with laughter.
Of familiarity. But I would also buy in a small I told you so point here about there is a Brexit element in this beyond doubt. And those of us who said, for goodness sake, go for the Norway option, stay in the European Economic Area, have been proven again and again to be right over this. If we'd done that, most of these things would never come. But I must here refer to what everybody knows is the truckers' newspaper, the Financial Times, which contains a fascinating series of details about this, which should go on record here. This is ONS figures. 40,000 of the 300,000 truck drivers in the UK were from the EU. This dropped by half, but it's now back up to 25,000. But huge numbers of truck drivers are leaving because they've been off, isolating or otherwise, during COVID. These are domestic ones, and they're not coming back. There's 50,000 UK-based drivers have left the profession since the pandemic began. Mainly those over 45, because they don't want to go back. Many of you will know people who have decided after this interval they don't want to go back to work, and they're not doing it. And this is one of the many disasters caused by what's going on. My final word on this is stop worrying about roads and lorries, build some railways, and start transporting stuff around by train. We don't have any trains anyway. Renationalise them, rebuild them, stop worrying about trucks.
And this is why we're investing...
Horrible, nasty, dangerous things that they are anyway.
This is why we're investing in apprenticeship schemes, etc., for drivers, because, there's nothing better than actually training up people in our own country to do these roles.
OK, back to Roderick, our question. Roderick, how do you answer your own question?
I'm interested in the fact that most of the focus has been on lorry drivers, and I'd like to pick up a point that Bridget made initially about having more female drivers in there. So instead of having the land girls like we had in the last war, we could have lorry ladies to take over or meet some of the efficiencies in demand. But overall, I think there should be more attention paid to things like the trade agreement with the European Union. That has probably contributed to it, and all the factors to do with workforce issues.
Okay.
Because it also extends to things like social care and other services. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
We appreciate it. 03700 100 444 if you'd like to talk about the whole business of wagon drivers, train drivers, logistics, Brexit, COVID, all of the issues we've discussed in the last couple of minutes. 03700 100 444. Sheila has our next question. Hello, Sheila.
Hello. I used to know what our different political parties stood for, but now I don't. Could the panel help me with a one-sentence definition of what each of our parliamentary parties fundamentally believe? Strictly one sentence.
Sheila, I must admit, when I saw your question earlier on, I thought, this is a good one. I think they're all good, but I thought this one is a good one. And the key word for me is strictly one sentence. So I'll ask each of you for your own political party, or for Peter, your own world view, to see if you can do your political philosophy, if you like, or your party's political philosophy in a sentence, preferably without too many commas. Starting with a capital letter, ending in a full stop. Sir Ed Davey.
We want to empower people so that they can take charge of their lives, whether it's in education, health or care, so people feel freer in their lives and have got more control. And we want to hold the powerful to account, whether they're fossil fuel companies or the City of London or this Conservative government.
Bridget Phillipson.
Whoever you are, wherever you're from, whichever family that you're born into, you have every chance and every opportunity to succeed in life with a government that makes that happen.
Andrea Jenkyns.
We are the Democrats who believe in democracy, and we believe in investing in our children's future.
Peter Hitchens.
Well, the Conservative Party is an organisation for obtaining office at any cost for the sons of gentlemen. The Labour Party is an organisation for promoting the interests of the population of the London Borough of Islington. And what the Liberal Democratic Party is, I simply cannot tell you.
I've just told you.
Any others? SNP, perhaps?
Well, I think it's obvious, isn't it?
Thought I'd give you the option to complete the quartet.
I know. Let's not waste time.
And a quick sentence on your political philosophy, Peter, because you've been on quite a political journey in your time.
Yes, I used to be. When I was here at the university, I was a Trotskyist, but I'm not.
Someone told me a tale that you once said, as an excuse for being late to a lecture, that you were fomenting revolution.
Greg Dyke making up a story about seminars we didn't both go to. No, I came to the conclusion several years ago that actually British politics was very funny. That it has no purpose, that it is, apart from being show business for, how shall I put it, not totally attractive people, it doesn't have...
You know how to flatter your fellow panels?
There is no politics in it anymore. They don't believe in anything. There is a profession.
Do you honestly believe
there is a profession of politics. People come out of university, they become special advisors. They then rise very quickly into becoming members of Parliament and ministers. They know very little and they care very little. And as I say, it's an ambitious profession which doesn't have any deep political principles at all, as I think we've seen. We've seen demonstrated beautifully this week.
Isn't that
by
a
a party
deeply
which stands for
view?
election as a Conservative party and does what this party.
Isn't that a deeply cynical view? And we've had the best part of half an hour conversation with a passionate exchange of views, people's passionate arguments about the range of topics we've done, and you're suggesting there's a kind of fakery to that.
I am suggesting there's a kind of fakery to it. Yes, absolutely.
03700.
To like you as well.
Chris?
Ed?
Can I say I think that's a huge disservice to lots of politicians from all political parties who work extremely hard for their constituents and try to put their country's best. And I would say to you, Peter, there are some tabloid journalists who like to be controversial so they can pick up a nice cheque at the end of the week.
I wasn't assessing you, Sir Ed, on your qualities as a social worker, which I've no doubt are extremely good. I was assessing you in your qualities as somebody who wants to lead and direct a major and important country, which is a wholly different activity.
OK, I think we've broken Sheila's maxim of one sentence. So at that point, we'll move on to Amanda next. Hello, Amanda.
Hello. Is it fair to young people already saddled with student debt to fund social care through the rise in national insurance proposed?
Thank you, Amanda. Andrea Jenkyns, Conservative MP, on this first.
Thank you, Chris. I mean, look, I'm a Conservative. I don't believe in tax rises.
But you voted for it?
Well, yes, and I'll explain why. And, you know, I believe in free markets, I believe in freedom. But when you actually look at the figures, you know, we're talking 5 million people waiting to have an operation at the moment, and they're saying it could get up to 13 million in just 3 months by the end of the year. That's 1 in 5 people. That's 1 in virtually every family across the UK. It could be stuff like hip operations, for example. And before the pandemic, you know, 9 out of 10 people was waiting something like 26 weeks for an operation. It's gone up to 44 now. The pandemic has changed things, unfortunately. And we need to raise money quickly. Because imagine if we didn't do anything. If we're talking 13 million people waiting for an operation by the end of the year, if we didn't do anything, what would happen? Now, it's not the first time a party has raised national insurance. In 2003, Labour did it by 1% to invest into the NHS.
Didn't they promise before the election before that that they wouldn't do it, though?
Yes, but the difference is, you know, pandemic, a global pandemic. And let's face it, I don't believe any successive government has fully tackled this social care crisis, including the one that Ed was part of as a Secretary of State under the coalition. None have. Okay. So I think it's very brave of the government to tackle this. It's not exactly the most popular way of doing it. However, it's tough decisions got to make. And on the specific, sorry to interrupt, on the specific of Amanda's question, because she's making a point about intergenerational fairness. Yes. Is it fair to young people to fund social care through a rise in national insurance? When you see that if you're earning £20,000, you're going to be paying an extra £130 a year in tax, £30,000 extra, £255 a year in tax. Is this fair on the young earners in their first job, potentially, paying that amount of extra tax from a party that spent its lifetime talking about being low tax? Yes. I mean, let's face it, young people are going to be old one day and potentially need social care themselves. We're seeing that Alzheimer's, dementia. I have dementia cafes that I set up and run in my own constituency. You know, we're seeing a massive rise in that. But the top 14% of earners will be paying 50% of the funds needed. And let's look what this looks like in figures. You know, the average salary UK, what is it, about 24,000? That works out about £3.40 odd p a week extra to pay on national insurance. We've already invested £12 billion. But I mean, on your point specifically about students, I mean, I went to university as a mature student while fighting the seat. I studied international relations at Lincoln, at the same time as doing economics through the Open Uni, at the same time as being a parliamentary candidate. And those 8 hours a week face-to-face time as a mature student, it didn't seem enough for me as a mature student who hadn't studied for 20-odd years. So what pupils have been through on the pandemic and do they feel that they've gone value for money? You know, they're paying massive amounts of money.
Enough. Meandering a little off the topic.
No, I'm just saying though, so back to that, you know, students would find it a very difficult pill to swallow, but as I said, they're going to get older one day, and it's, you know, the more you earn, the more you pay, and I think it should be all hands on deck to tackle this crisis.
Thank you. Bridget Phillipson, Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, therefore in charge of the numbers for Labour and big decisions for a government to take, for an opposition to consider around a rise in national insurance to fund social care, something successive governments have avoided doing anything about. How do you take on Amanda's question?
It isn't fair and it won't work. So I don't think it's right to expect the burden to fall on working people and onto businesses actually who are going to really struggle in the months ahead.
Who's going to pay for it then, Bridget?
I'll happily come on to that, Andrea. But at the same time, there isn't a plan backing all of this up. There is no plan for the NHS, how we clear those backlogs. You know, Andrea, you said that there were 5 million people on the waiting list. They were there already. That was before the pandemic. It's completely wrong to suggest that these problems have just appeared during the pandemic.
It hasn't increased during the pandemic, is that what you're saying?
What I'm saying is the NHS has had a decade now of neglect from your government, which meant that going into the pandemic, it was already weakened. But running alongside this tax rise, which is going to really hurt working people and really hurt businesses as well. There is no plan for how this is going to lead to any improvement in social care.
But your
also
shadow secretary
Andrea,
said he backed rises previously in tax to pay for the NHS.
So what we believe quite clearly is that those with the broader shoulders should make more of a contribution. Of course, this has to be paid for. We all recognise this. But your government, time and time again, first comes to working people. Universal credit, national insurance, council tax, the pressures that people are facing. And take, for example, the constituent that I met today, who's an unpaid carer for her mother who has dementia. Will what is being set out do anything to improve the working conditions of carers? Will it do anything to improve the quality of care? No, it won't, and we will not support it.
How would Labour pay for this?
Of course, the funding of public services, and that includes social care, should be borne across the taxation system, and it should be done in a fair way. Why we oppose this? Well, there are a range of ways in which you could do it. You can look, for example, to a whole range of income measures, but it shouldn't always... For example, what the measure does around national insurance doesn't ask anything of
That's critiquing the government,
have...
which obviously is part of your job, but what's the Labour plan? Where would you tax to generate this kind of money?
So you could look... there are a range of different options within the tax system.
Income tax, wealth tax?
You can look at measures that are fair across the generations and across income. This measure meets neither test. Well, there are, for example... If you think
about this one, if you think of the
Briefly.
devolved powers of Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, etc., you've got to consider that as well. Now, this makes sure that that's considered. You haven't actually said one thing that you would do.
Could I just possibly make a point? I mean, those of us who have lived through Labour chancellors and Tory chancellors in hard times know that under these circumstances they behave almost identically. The Labour Party has very little to say about this because they would have done, obviously not an identical thing, but something very similar if they were in the same position. What is this position? The first point to make is the delusion that the fact that you pay more tax will mean that you get better services or that the things which are promised to you will happen is a very serious delusion. First of all, there's no guarantee that any of this money will ever actually reach social care. If it's diverted initially to the National Health Service, it'll be very difficult to get out of it again because the National Health Service is an enormous pit. So that might well not happen. The point really here is that we are having the first wave of the enormous payment for the panic into which our government went over COVID. The first payment of many because they spent far more money than they had. They pretended for 18 months that there was a magic money tree, something which they'd mocked Jeremy Corbyn for saying there was. They pretended there was. They spent limitlessly. And now we are going to have to pay it back in higher taxes. And I absolutely guarantee you also in quite heavy inflation and in reduced services. And this is the beginning of it. And whichever of these people was in power, this is what you will get. You're paying the bill for a major piece of spendthrift folly.
I want to get to another question in a second before we run out of time, but Sir Ed Davey next, Lib Dem leader, but also a carer for your son, and you were for your mum, was it, as well?
Yeah, I'll come to that if I may, but to answer the question first of all, this isn't a fair way of funding social care. The burden will fall unfairly on younger people. And why is that particularly unfair in this case? The biggest beneficiary of the cap on care costs will be older people and the wealthiest people, the people with the highest value properties. And although they're going to be the beneficiaries, we're asking young and middle-aged workers to pay the biggest share of the bills. That is wrong. And it is even worse than that because it won't fix care. You know, you're right, I've been a carer most of my life. I was a carer for my mother when she was dying when I was a teenager. And I looked after my wonderful Nana when she was frail and elderly. And I've got a lovely 13-year-old severely disabled son who my wife and I care for. So I've done a lot of caring in my life. And there are millions of people out there like me who care for their family members. It's a big part of their lives too. And I've been wanting a social care package. I've been wanting our country to benefit from because those millions of unpaid carers aren't getting the support they need. And you know what? This care package contains nothing for them. Worse still, for the paid carers who are looking after our elderly people in the care homes, our disabled people in the care homes, it's not dealing with the huge shortage, 120,000 vacancies in care staff, nothing for them in this package. I think it's really sad, it's unfair, and it's not going to fix care.
03700 100 444 if you'd like to talk about care on any answers. Our final question this week from Thomas. Hello, Thomas.
Hello. The events of the past few months, combined with the IPCC report, paint a bleak picture for the environment. Is the UK doing enough to tackle the climate crisis?
We just heard from Sir Ed on the previous question, but you are a former climate change secretary, so take this one on first, if you may.
We're not doing anywhere near enough. When I was Cabinet Minister, the Liberal Democrats, we nearly quadrupled renewable power, made us the world leader in offshore wind, and the Tories have squandered that achievement. But we need to do even more than just do well in our own country. We're only 2% of global greenhouse gas emissions. We need to use our power internationally. And guess what? We've got that in the City of London. In the City of London, a lot of money for the fossil fuel industry around the world, oil, gas and coal, is raised. I think over 15% of money raised for coal exploitation around the world is raised in London. We need to change the rules and regulations on the City of London so we turn off that tap. We have that power, not just to do more in our own country with renewables and energy efficiency and so on, but through the City of London we can have a massive impact across the world, and we need to see that sort of leadership, and we're just not getting it from Boris Johnson.
Thank you. A request for relatively short answers as we head towards the brick wall of the end of the programme. Bridget Phillipson for Labour next.
No, we're not doing nearly enough as a country, and we've got to do a lot more. We should be bringing forward capital investment to create those new jobs that we desperately need to see. I mean, not just because it's the right thing to do in tackling climate change, but also we know we face kind of big challenges within the economy as well. We've led the world so often, and on this we should be leading the world too. You know, in my city in Sunderland, we've developed so much of the tremendous technology around electric cars. This is a real opportunity to create good, well-paid, highly skilled jobs. And in fact, in recent years, we've seen a reduction in the number of jobs in these kinds of areas. We should harness the tremendous potential that we have as a country, tackle climate change, lead the world, but also create jobs in parts of the country where we desperately need to see more.
Peter Hitchens, do politicians need to be honest about what people might have to give up if these various climate targets are to be met?
Well, I wish they would do, because our policy is based on the most ludicrous posturing. And earlier on this week, on Monday, not far down the road from here at the West Burton power station, we switched on a coal-fired power station because there wasn't enough wind, and because gas had become so incredibly expensive, we couldn't afford to bring it in to run gas power stations. That's the state of our power generation system, in which we have eliminated almost all coal-fired burning stations, at the same time as China, which already has 1,000 gigawatts of coal-fired power, is building 259 gigawatts of coal-fired power. We never had anything remotely resembling that. Our entire power system is about 85 gigawatts, and one power station is about 1.5. Our contribution to the... let's set aside any argument about whether the arguments are correct. Our contribution to reducing carbon through this is incredibly tiny and totally cancel that.
So what should we do?
Totally cancel that.
Should we just say to hell with it and carry on as normal?
That's another argument. You wanted me to be brief. I don't think there's a possibility of being brief about man-made global warming. What I'm saying is that on its own terms, the British government's policy is self-destructive. Not merely do we shut down these coal-fired power stations, when we shut them down, we immediately demolish them. So there's no possibility, if we need them back, of bringing them back into action, as happened earlier on this week. If what happened on Monday to our power system, which is lacking in both power and inertia, which is a vital part of power generation, if what happened on Monday happens again next year, West Burton will be shut. And almost certainly within a few months of being shut, it will be blown up, and we won't be able to do that, making us either victims of power cuts or dependent upon imported electricity from people who may not want to supply it to us.
What should we do now, though, as a country? Should we say, you know, to hell with all of these targets and get rid of them and carry on as we used to, or what?
Well, we should stop this dogmatic self-destruction which we're engaged in, for certain. If anybody's seriously concerned about these things and believes the views of Greta Thunberg and the Extinction Rebellion, then the country which they should be turning to is China. And China has publicly said this week it's not interested in being told what to do. and it will not be told what to do. China will pursue its own coal-fired policies, and it will burn as much coal as it wants to, whatever we do. And if we can't change that, then almost everything that is said here tonight is nothing more than empty posturing.
Andrea Jenkyns, you were nodding your head then on the point about China.
Most definitely. I mean, the climate change activists, if they want to vent their anger and frustration towards somebody, it'd be China. I mean, I think we're doing amazing as a country. You know, we was the first to set world leading targets, the first economy to set a net zero target, and we've shown we're investing in green jobs. So, you know, to people saying that we're not, I'd say that's poppycock.
And what's a Peter's point that maybe there's no point? What's a Peter's point that maybe there's no point given what's happening in China? You agree with him on that point. So what about the argument that might then say, is all this stuff worth doing?
Well, I think you know, it's always if you know, as a government, as a party, whichever political party, you've got a strong belief in something and you know, so-called saving the planet, etc. Then
so-called saving the planet.
You should invest in it.
But Andrea, who's going to provide the power for all these electric cars you want everybody to have?
Briefly.
Where's it going to come from?
And
you're talking to somebody who's got a diesel car.
Nobody has a clue.
Yeah.
These things are constantly projected. We're going to have zero this and zero.
So Ed Davey, in our remaining 30 seconds.
First of all, let's be clear. Peter's wrong on this point about coal. We could have easily had gas power stations online. They were there. The system chose not to put them on. So we had plenty of power.
I said that.
Well, I'm glad you're confirming that.
No,
but on China, you're right. People are right that China needs to take action. But China has been moving far faster than people think in wind and solar. And what we need to do is really work with them in Glasgow, COP26.
Thank you.
Is Johnson doing that?
Which we're hosting here,
isn't.
which shows you, you know, what we're doing.
Okay. Thank you very much all from here at the University of York. Thank you for listening.